Sign-up sheets, if you'd like to be part of our email list, please do so at the counter. We have Dee, we have Isabel, we have John and Susanna behind the counter, as well as Chaucer. For future events, we have our board there in chaucersbooks.com. Coming up on Thursday, we're bringing Academy Award winning composer, a book about Elmer Bernstein there, written by his son Peter Bernstein. So please come by on Thursday if you can make it. This, as you can see, is being filmed for our YouTube channel and will be available shortly after program's completion. So cheers to our new mugs here. Tonight, I'm really pleased to bring both of these authors here. First, I'd like to introduce Kemper Donovan. He's a graduate of Stanford and Harvard Law School. He's a smart one. He worked at a literary management company called Circle of Confusion, and he repped the screenwriter for one of my favorite movies of the early 2010s, Hannah, which of course starred Saoirse Ronan. Congratulations on that. It's a wonderful movie. He co-founded a podcast that he currently hosts called About Agatha, meaning, of course, Agatha Christie. And I think you guys categorized, how did you categorize all those?
We ranked all 66 of Christie's novels.
Wow, that's a lot of dedication.
Yes, it was a years-long project.
His highly entertaining debut novel, The Busybody, here, was said by Sophie Hannah, a gripping and highly entertaining mystery with ingenuity and flair aplenty, and a wonderful detective character that readers will be dying to meet again. I can't agree more. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. He also has his website, KemperDonovan.com. Please give a hand to Kemper. And to my right, it's the second time she's been with Chaucer. It's the first time virtually. She, of course, is an Academy Award nominated screenwriter for Letters from Iwo Jima in 2006. She was working in Hollywood for about 15 years and developing material for both film and streaming. She's taught screenwriting at UCLA. She's an advocate for women and diversity in the entertainment industry. Her first foray into the literary world was City Under One Roof right there. It's a wonderful novel that made Best Crime Novel of 2023 by several publications. Now she brings us Village in the Dark here. It's the Bible of book reviews, Kirkus Reviews, has called it sharp and gritty mystery, and I couldn't agree more. With an eclectic group of colorful characters dealing with suspicious deaths in a frozen land, it's a page turner that may prompt you to put on your down jacket and gloves while you read it. Please welcome Iris Yamashita. Okay, I gotta ask before I turn it over to you, how did you two meet each other?
Well, Kemper also represented me when I was at Circle of Confusion.
Yes.
So that's how
When you were singling out Hannah, I thought you were about to say Iris, and I was like, oh no, we went a different direction. But yes, I was lucky enough to manage Iris as well. I think glommed onto the team that was representing you. I was already in Circle when you came into Circle, but I remember I was like, I want to be on the Iris team.
Oh, yeah, and he was always such a great, not only manager, but friend, even back then. Like, he was somebody you could always kind of ask advice to, he was just great. So we stayed in touch, and all those years, and he had written another book before that as well.
Yeah, he did.
Before this one.
And what was that book?
That was a book called The Decent Proposal. So this is like my debut mystery novel,
Yes.
and then that wasn't a mystery. It was a literary novel that featured some suspense, mystery adjacent, let's say, but not a straightforward mystery.
Interesting. I hope you'll talk about how you collaborate together, bounce off ideas off each other. So, you have, correct? Yes.
In the screenwriting
Okay.
world, I did, but not on the book thing.
Yeah,
Pretty
Okay.
sad.
we inspire each other from afar.
Yes.
Let's put it that way.
My last comment was, they're both wonderful novels, but they're very different. Yours is along the traditional lines of an Agatha Christie novel.
Yes.
And yours is more of a thriller, but they're just so diverse, but they feel connected in a way. I'm not sure why, but just wanted to let you know.
I love that they're both mysteries, you know, and I love the fact that mine's more of a puzzle mystery, I would say. Yours is more of a thriller mystery, but I love that like they fall under the same umbrella, which is one of my favorite things about the mystery genre. With my first book, actually, I remember after I wrote it, I realized that it was expected of me to write the same kind of book again, and I was like, I don't know if I want to write the same kind of book again. But with mystery, I really feel like, oh, this is a genre that I can exist in for a while, because I think there's so much breadth to it, you know?
That's great. All right, why don't you take away the talk?
Well, I'll ask the first question. So, congratulations. Kemper's book, The Busybody, has been on the USA Today bestseller list for 3 weeks now. And that is a huge, momentous feat. So, John, so tell us about your book, and can you please read an excerpt?
Yeah, so in addition to having written this first novel and now writing this mystery, there are actually a lot of years in between my first novel and this novel, about 8 years to be exact. And one of the things that I've been doing during that time is co-hosting and then hosting a podcast called All About Agatha, which is dedicated to the one and only Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. And I started that very much as a joint venture with my good friend Catherine Brobeck. Catherine actually passed away at the end of 2021. So that's why I started out as a co-host, and now I'm doing it solo. But this book is dedicated to her because I really wouldn't have, I think, figured out how passionate I am about mysteries if I hadn't done the podcast with Catherine, and I never would have done the podcast unless I could do it with her. So I really owe this book to her. And so Catherine and I started this podcast about 7 years ago in September of 2016. And there was a very big event on the near horizon at that point, which was the 2016 presidential election, which I think a lot of people will remember. This was the Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump face-off, and I think regardless of political affiliation, it was a pretty tumultuous time. And there was a period directly after that election when people were sort of wondering what Hillary Clinton was up to, because it was a little bit like, what does one do after an experience like that? And this was that weird time when there were like photos of her taking long walks in the woods behind her house. And there was just something about that weirdo moment in time that stuck with me as a great setting for a murder mystery. I didn't write it anytime soon after that. It took a couple of years actually until I kind of got up the courage to start a mystery of my own, but that kernel always stuck with me. So The Busybody starts with a ghostwriter who specializes in celebrity memoir getting a call that this recently defeated politician wants to write a memoir of her own. Her name is Dorothy Gibson, and she's just lost this election for president in a very public way, and she's been meaning to write a memoir forever, but she never had the time, and now, of course, in the wake of her very public defeat, she has all the time in the world, and there's a lot of interest in what this memoir would be. And the ghostwriter who Dorothy hires is the first-person narrator of the story. And if you're wondering what this woman's name is, I'm afraid I cannot tell you because she is never named in the story, not once. She's a rather enigmatic and withholding character. So it felt organic not to name her, but I was also partly inspired here by Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, which also very famously features a first-person, nameless female narrator. And Dorothy Gibson is not simply a stand-in for Hillary Clinton. She is partially based on Hillary Clinton, of course, but there are also a number of female politicians who broke into politics in the earlier 20th century through this phenomenon known as widow's mandate. So this was when a male politician died and his widow was called upon to fill out his term until a more suitable replacement could be found. And by suitable, of course, people back then meant male. But a lot of these women did not go away, and they had very successful careers of their own. And one of the most successful examples of widow's mandate is Margaret Chase Smith. So she was a Republican senator from the great state of Maine, and her husband was a U.S. representative when he passed away. So she finished his term, then she went on to do more terms as a representative and then become a senator for decades. And she's actually probably most remembered nowadays for delivering this speech on the floor of the Senate called the Declaration of Conscience, where she was denouncing McCarthyism. It's a very fiery denunciation. I'm a big fan of hers, and there's a lot of Margaret Chase Smith in Dorothy Gibson. Her middle name is Chase, and I set the book in Maine. So she's a former senator of Maine, and it's at Dorothy's house, which is surrounded by woods, where she and her ghostwriter settle down, basically, and begin to work together on this memoir. A few days into working together, they go and make a little run to a local liquor store, as one does, for some much needed red wine. And they run into a woman who lives in the area named Vivian Davis. And Dorothy's never met her before, but strangers come up to her constantly, especially in the wake of the election. And Vivian says how sorry she is that Dorothy lost the election, and how worried she is about what's going to happen now that the man who won is going to become president, because this is during that little window of time between the election and the inauguration, or at the end of November, beginning of December. And Dorothy and the ghostwriter kind of brush Vivian off. She's a bit annoying. But a couple days later, they find out that she has died, seemingly by her own hand. She's found drowned in her bathtub with a bottle of sleeping pills by her side. But something about this doesn't sit right with Dorothy. So she goes to Vivian's memorial, and she drags her ghostwriter with her. And they have a bunch of interactions with a cast of weird and suspicious characters there. And they, afterward, after the memorial, Dorothy takes it upon herself to speed up Vivian's toxicology report. Since as any mystery aficionado, I'm sure there are a couple of you here can tell you, the way that the tox report takes like 2 seconds in a Law & Order episode is totally bogus. It doesn't really happen that way in real life. But Dorothy kind of wields her local influence to goose along the proceedings, and she asks for the tox report, and about 24 hours later it comes back. And it is at this point that I would like to read from my book here. So here we go. So this is a scene now that's happening among Dorothy and her screenwriter, her ghostwriter, and also her longtime assistant / confidant, a woman named Layla Mansour, who may or may not bear a striking resemblance to Hillary Clinton's longtime personal assistant and confidant, Huma Abedin. All right, here we go. Layla burst into the library holding her iPad in both hands, its screen facing outward. Have you seen this? Seen what? Asked Dorothy wearily. Layla handed her the tablet. Just read it. She took it with a sigh, but when she saw what was on the screen, she sat up straight, bringing it closer to her face. What's going on? I asked. The toxicology report's in. It's done already? Layla nodded as if to say, of course. She was used to things happening at warp speed upon request. This was the world she and Dorothy lived in, and they had imposed their exacting standards on the Office of the Medical Examiner for Cumberland County. It's not the full report from what I can tell, but a big enough chunk of it was just leaked to the press. Story broke a few minutes ago. Why? I asked again, more impatiently this time. What does it say? Dorothy looked up. Vivian Davis didn't have a single drug in her body. What? We all stared at one another. I guess you can't drown yourself, right? Asked Layla. Not in a bathtub you can't, replied Dorothy. But it still doesn't make any sense. Layla popped a squat in front of the couch, her curtain of hair nearly reaching the floor. If someone held her down, she'd have bruises all over her body, some sort of mark. Even if she bumped her head and it was just an accident, you'd see the bump. There were no external signs of trauma, right? Right, said Dorothy. So it couldn't have been an accident. But then how the hell did it happen? We fell quiet, thinking it over. Bride's in the bath, I shouted, piercing the silence. Layla turned her head sideways, a bird-like, quizzical movement. Excuse me? Bride's in the bath. It was this famous case from the early 20th century. This psychopath, George Joseph Smith, married women all over England. Usually he'd just clear out their savings and disappear, but 3 of them ended up dead in the exact same way. They were all found drowned in a bathtub with no marks on their body, no signs of violence. Mm-hmm, Dorothy was nodding her head. This is ringing a bell. The reason the case is so famous is that there was this pathologist, Bernard Spilsbury, who figured out how Smith did it. He actually hired female divers and tested his theory by putting them in a bath. When he pulled on their feet really quickly, the water flooding their nose and mouth would cause them to lose consciousness, and they'd drown. One of them almost did drown, actually, during the test. It was easier than anyone thought, and there were no signs of violence. Smith was put on trial for the 3rd murder, but the prosecution used the pattern established in the first 2 as evidence that he must have done the 3rd one as well. It was the first time that was ever done, all on the basis of Spilsbury's experiments. He's sort of a forensics hero for that reason, even though he started buying into his own hype and became kind of awful. I paused for breath. They were both looking at me with admiration, and maybe a little fear. Seems like you're a good person to have around when something like this happens, observed Dorothy. Is it possible to be flattered and insulted at the same time? Apparently so. This doesn't look so good for Walter Vogel then, said Layla. No, I agreed. In Smith's case, only a husband or a maid would have had the access required to pull off a murder like that. And a lot of the women he married didn't have their own maids. Well, I suppose there's an argument to be made that the other people may have had access to Vivian while she was taking a bath, said Dorothy, reasoning it out in her lawyerly way. I nodded. Her sister at the very least, but who knows? Modesty quotients have changed a lot since 100 years ago. And she didn't seem like the most modest person in the world, I added, somewhat uncharitably, which is why I followed this up with a question. Does it say anything about the time of death in there? Based on temperature readings taken at the scene, Dorothy was reading from the article, the time of death is estimated to have been anywhere between 9 p.m. last Wednesday night, the 30th of November, and 3 a.m. the next morning, the 1st of December. Oh shit, TMZ just picked it up. Layla was looking at her phone now. This is going to be everywhere in about 2 seconds, and I mean everywhere. The cause of death is not conclusive, Dorothy read on, but the police are currently operating on the assumption of death by foul play. It slipped so easily out of her mouth. The police, death by foul play. And yet with these words, everything changed. We sat there gaping at one another, till Layla's phone began ringing, followed by Dorothy's. And then, things did what in my experience they seldom do. They began to happen. Fast. I just also want to note that the Bernard Spilsbury stuff and the brides in the bath, all of that is true. That is a famous true crime case, and weaving true crime into the book was one of my many homages to Agatha Christie that I built into the book, because she, believe it or not, actually does do that a lot as well. There's a lot of true crime referenced in Christie.
All right.
So Iris, I would love if you would basically do the same thing. Tell us a little about your book and read us a passage.
Okay, so this is my second book, and it's the second book in the series, Village in the Dark. And so the first book was called City Under One Roof. And I'll just go into that as a little bit of background. But Kara Kennedy is a police detective from Anchorage, Alaska. And she has recently lost her husband and her son in a hiking accident. And she is kind of obsessed with how they might have died, which is, she's told it's a hiking accident. But it sends her in the first book to a very strange and isolated city, which is inspired by a real city in Alaska. But in this fictional city, Point Meteor, Alaska, all 200 and some residents live in a single high-rise building. And the only way into the city by land is through a single tunnel through a mountain. It's 2.5 miles long. And of course, she gets trapped there. She's looking into a case where some dismembered body parts wash up on the shore of the city. And she just is going there to check it out, and then of course there's an avalanche which traps her there, and she solves a crime there which is seemingly unrelated to what happened to her husband and her son. But in the second book, she has just gotten some clues that maybe there was some kind of connection, and that maybe there was foul play involved. So it begins with her unearthing exhuming the bodies of her husband and son. And so the second book is much more personal, and it's about finding answers about what happened. And I've told my both stories in three narratives. Of course, there's the main character, Kara Kennedy, and in the first book, I had a young teenager who lived in the building, and another character who has a mental disability who spoke in word salads. And then for the second book, I've chosen the same Kara Kennedy, but now I'm taking a voice who is a character in the first book, but she had remained mysterious throughout the first book. And she is the innkeeper of the building, because in this building there's everything. There's hotel rooms, there's a police station, there's a grocery store, so there's everything that you need in the building. And she is the innkeeper, and she's kind of a surly woman with a southern accent who has this Bonnie and Clyde past. And so she's one of the voices. And then another voice, her name is Mia Upash, and she is a young character who grew up on a off-the-grid village, which is run by women. And she's sort of a dark horse character, so you don't really know what her role is. And all the stories come together at the end. But I'm choosing to read from Ellie, the innkeeper. She's fun to read. Okay. Ellie Wright puffed lazy smoke rings into the air and patted her red bun wig while considering her poker hand at what she called her weekly board meeting at the Salty Pub. She was the owner of the Cozy Condo Inn, really a floor of small apartments in the building that was home to all 205 residents of Point Meteor. There were no guests staying at the Cozy Condo at the moment. Beyond September, few tourists came to visit an icebox city in Alaska with no ski slopes or dog sledding tours, which could only be reached via a one-way tunnel through a mountain. In high season, people flocked to the pier by the busload, boarding or exiting the cruise ships like gaggles of squawking geese. Motorboats lined up to launch off the slips for fishing or whale watching. Most of the people blew in and out the same day, but a good number of hikers and tree huggers booked overnight rooms. The temporary help who only came for the season also made for good business for Ellie's 14th floor rooms. Ellie charged the tourists an arm and a leg because, well, why not? But she gave the temporary help, the summer people, as the kids like to call them, a discount because they were just there trying to make a living, and their months-long stays didn't include daily maid service. Ellie could take in all of her year's earning in the 4 months of high season. Not bad for a woman in her 60s who had grown up in the backwoods of Arkansas on the edge of poverty and had dropped out of high school, not knowing diddly from squat. But now, being February, Point Meteor was a bleak ghost town with temperatures cold enough to freeze a brass monkey. Most of the businesses along the pier were shuttered, except, of course, the Salty Pub, which was a goddamn necessity. And sometimes the petite Chinese lady, Mrs. Lin, kept Star Asian food open, but most days Mrs. Lin ran a takeout operation from her unit in the Davidson condos, or the Daveco, as it was known. Since Ellie was always on the lookout for her ex-husband, she also prided herself on being an unofficial neighborhood watcher who monitored the comings and goings of the Daveco through the big glass window of her check-in lobby on the 9th floor. The whale-watching binoculars she always kept at her side weren't really for whale watching. Some might think of her as a gossip queen or the town snitch, but that was hogwash, because Ellie only gathered info, never spilled. She knew everybody in Point Meteor had secrets to keep, and she wasn't one to judge, because she had her own skeletons that were better left in the closet. She always had the best interests of the townsfolk in mind, whether they appreciated it or not. Chief Sipley's phone jingled the theme to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. He got up to answer, taking his mug over to the bartender for a refill. He was technically on duty since JB was still recovering from his recent injuries, and Ellie knew from the ringtone that it was a forwarded call from the station. It was probably about one of the elevators getting stuck again, or maybe about the Samoan family's dog crapping in the 6th floor hallway. Chuck Marino splayed his cards out, a pair of aces, a good hand, but not enough to beat Ellie's, which she laid down, ready to cash in. Now it was just Jim, who was a hard son of a bitch to read because he always had that calm, steady look on his face, as if he were some kind of Buddha, or maybe shaman was the right word, given that Jim was indigenous. He finally flashed a toothy smile, showing his full house of 3 7s and a pair of jacks before gleefully raking in his chips. Before Ellie could say, "Son of a red wattle hog-sucking bitch," Chief called to her, pointing at his phone with a stone-cold sober expression. "Ellie, you gotta take this," he said. And he didn't add some kind of joke like, "It's the debt collectors," or "Some guy says he's got a Tinder date with you," which was usually Sipley's style. So Ellie knew it must be something serious as hell. Even Chuck and Jim looked up in anticipation. The immediate thought running through Ellie's mind was that it had something to do with her tax fudging, or maybe her ex catching up with her. She took the phone, preparing to do battle. Hello? She's spoken to Sipley's cell. We've been trying to reach you, the characterless voice on the other end said. Ellie didn't have a cell phone. She had a regular landline where guests could leave a voice message, and she could screen to decide whether she wanted to get back to them. Anyone else who would want to talk to her knew where to find her in person. We believe Timothy Christopher McCullum is your son? Ellie's pulse started pounding. McCullum had been her married name, and Timmy was indeed her only son. But the last time she had laid eyes on him was 6 years ago. Yes, she finally answered. What has he gone and done now? I'm so sorry to tell you this, but he was found dead in his apartment early this morning. Okay, thank you. So you did talk a lot about your female characters, which answered some of my questions. But I was interested, and I just love your female ghostwriter's POV and the way she speaks. And just as a little taste, I'll read a little excerpt that I love, where she describes a character she's meeting for the first time. I have never seen a more desiccated human being than Mina Hawley. Whole swaths of her chin and forehead were flaking off. Her swollen lips had deep, painful-looking cracks in them, and when she gave me her hand, it felt as though I were grasping a cheese grater. I just love her voice. But why did you choose a two-hander with two characters, and why not just the senator or just the ghostwriter's POV, and why keep her unnamed?
Okay. Well, so I definitely wanted to choose a detective sidekick duo because that felt very traditional to me, and I wanted to kind of write a book, again, in homage to Agatha Christie and a lot of the classic crime writers, which often do feature that kind of a setup, Watson and Holmes, Hastings and Poirot, and I really liked the idea of the book being narrated by the sidekick because I think it's a very, Christie makes a lot of really good use of irony in having Hastings, who's a little dim, narrate a lot of her stories. And I kind of did the opposite because I think my narrator is actually very smart, and she's very erudite, but she also has to be very wrong-headed in terms of how she sees the investigation, or else the book would be over in 20 pages because she would just solve it. So that was a challenge that I embraced. But basically, from the beginning, this book was sold as the first in a 3-book series, so I knew that there would be 2 more of these. And my idea is that I'm going to actually be taking my ghostwriter sidekick, and she's going to be the one who travels from book to book, pairing up with a different detective in each book. So it's basically like a sidekick series, and I just wanted to do a different, I wanted to, again, build in a lot of appreciation for traditional detective fiction, but do something different, because why am I here if I'm not going to do something a little bit different? So it felt like a way to have my cake and eat it too, essentially, given where I'm going to go with that. So it will become a lot less traditional, I think. But I just really like that structure. And I also just liked these 2 women who were working together. And I have these they're not quite comic relief, but there are 2 male policemen who are very much their foils, or sort of the counterpart to them as they're engaging this amateur investigation. And let's just say there's a major contrast, I think, between how those 2 duos function in the book. That makes sense.
Yeah, very interesting.
So I wanted to ask you, and I think you could tell a little bit in the excerpt that you read, how much you use your setting of Alaska. It's one of my favorite things about both of these books, because you really feel like you're in Alaska and I've never been to Alaska myself, but I felt like I was there in both of these books, and not just as to, I think, the coldness and the lack of light, because this is happening, sort of in the winter months, but you place us there, I think, in a very physical, visceral way, but that sense of isolation, because this is a town that's even more isolated than your run-of-the-mill town in Alaska, because you have to go through a tunnel to get there, and then there's an avalanche that blocks the tunnel. So that's in the first book. But I also was really struck by the fact that I think you talk a lot about how many disappearances there are in Alaska. I think, and I wrote down the quote that you had, where did you say, 2,000 people a year? Which is a shocking number to me. 2,000 people a year in Alaska go missing?
Yes, I was shocked too when I saw that statistic, but when you think about Alaska, it's just vast swaths of wilderness.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to commit resources to covering all of that wilderness, so a lot of people do go missing, and yeah, it's just, you know, it takes a certain kind of person to live out there, I think.
It does, and there's so many, and I want to quote from you, because this was such a like sort of fun fact, but again, another way that I think you really bring us into Alaska. At one point, this is in a section from Mia's point of view. She's the younger character. Indigenous, she's actually not an indigenous Alaskan, right? She's an indigenous Japanese.
Yes.
And also, well, her mother is, and then her father's right. And it's complicated. It's very complicated in a good way. But you're right. Mia knew there were tiny airstrips and seaplane bases all over Alaska. Over 500, they had once told her, because that's how people got around without having to drive through the millions of acres of mostly undeveloped wilderness. And that really brought it home to me, where I was like, wow, there is so much wilderness in Alaska that you need a plane to get through it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to, because there's too much of it. And that's really interesting to me. But my question now is that I think you also make so much of the fact that Point Metier is where a lot of women go who were in abusive relationships, and this is a theme that's also in the village where Mia grew up in. It's called Unity, and it's where a lot of women went who felt oppressed in some way. And it feels like this is related to the sense of isolation, and that people potentially go to Alaska to disappear or to get away. And I'm just curious, was Alaska, did you start with your setting? It feels like such a fundamental part of the story that I'm just curious how you came to set the story in Alaska and came up with the story in the first place.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. It is inspired by a real city, which I had seen a documentary on over 20 years ago, because back then there wasn't even a car road in. The only way in was by train through that same tunnel, but you could only go via train. And I had read something, I started doing a lot of research on that area, on that place, on that city that was originally built as a military base, so therefore the isolation made sense. It was supposed to be a secret military base. And then when they opened it up to residents, there was only one building that survived, and that became the condo where they all live in. I had read something about a person who had run away from her abusive husband, and so there was like a keeper of the train, who comes in and who comes out, and if he came by, then he wasn't allowed on the train. So. And I heard that people were very upset when they actually did open it to car traffic, because then it was harder to control. But just doing that kind of research, then I also read the statistic about, you know, the high incidence of violence against women in Alaska. It's the state with the highest rates of violence, and so that sort of just became a theme. So it was a little bit in the first book, and then also I had read that majority of it is among the indigenous population. So I thought I wanted to showcase a little bit of indigenous women, and I did consult with someone from the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center to get more information. My village is made up, but I tried to pull in different indigenous people, and the Ainu character, Ainu is indigenous Japanese, just came in because as I was researching some of this, it was kind of amazing to me how much similarity there is between the cultures, and even their artwork is similar, and some of their belief systems are similar. So I thought I just wanted to throw in a connection there. Yeah, because this village is open to non-indigenous people even, so it's not like, so we have like a hodgepodge of different tribes and things. So
had you mapped out the two books when you started writing that book? Because you really do lay the groundwork for Kara and what happened to her husband and son in the first book, and then that's very much what the second book is about. So had you mapped out everything from the beginning?
I knew I had a two book deal, so I knew there was going to be a second part. So I kind of had a general idea of how the story would continue in the second book, and a kind of idea of how it was going to end, but not the details.
Right.
And so I want to ask you the same question, because you have a 3-book deal, so do you have it all mapped out? And the same question.
I don't have it mapped out because these books are more procedural, I guess you could almost say. I mean, there's going to be a major mystery for each book. I do have a little bit of a serialized mystery as to who the ghostwriter is, what makes her tick, why is she the kind of person who wouldn't even want to, you know, give her name in a book. Not that, I mean, she's in the story, so it's not like she's not offering her name to us as the reader, but she, like I said, she's very withholding and enigmatic, and it's not so much that there's necessarily some huge mystery to her, but she is someone who we'll get to know little by little as the books go on.
That was the question of mine too, so I'm glad you answered.
That's why I made her the part of the reason why I made her that kind of a person. And then, and each book will just have a fresh setting and hopefully, you know, maintain some freshness that way.
Well, on your setting too, you have this this crystal palace, which was really intriguing to read about, with an entire facade made out of windows, like a single pane of glass.
Yeah.
Is that based on any real place?
It's not. It's not based on anything real at all. I know, which has been like one of the biggest compliments. People were like, I was Googling Crystal Palace names.
I did too. I was like, where is this place? I want to see this. I really thought it was real.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I did, I used the real Crystal Palace in England as a little bit of inspiration, and that of course exists, even to this day, but no, that was totally made up, and I'm not even sure where that came from, but I think the main setting came out of, again, Margaret Chase Smith a little bit, and it felt like a good setting for this traditional mystery in the midst of the woods at a cold time of year. There's snow, and it's not nearly as cold as it is in Iris's books, but or forbidding. But yeah, that's where that comes from.
So you have previously written a book that was a romantic comedy called The Decent Proposal, which was also very witty and funny in parts. So what made you switch to mysteries, and how is this experience writing the second book compared to writing the first book?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So definitely it was the podcast. I mean, the podcast really, I think, taught me that it sounds so ridiculous because you should have perfect self-knowledge, because like, why do you not know yourself? But like, I really didn't know the depth of my passion for mystery until I started doing this podcast, you know, as a fully grown adult. And it just dawned on me a couple of years into it where I was like, I should be sick of this by now. Like, I should be sick of how many hours of every week I'm devoting toward preparing for these episodes, recording these episodes, editing these episodes, reading material, and not just the books, but all of this secondary, you know, source material and other scholarly works on Agatha Christie. And I was just like, I just want more and more and more of this. And yet I'm a writer, so how could I not be writing a mystery? And then when I started, so after my first book, I did the very cliche thing of writing my sophomore novel, and it was a disaster. Like, and a lot of writers talk about this, how the first book is magical because it's something that you've been dreaming about. And then like you write that, and then it's like, oh, now I have to do this all over again. Okay. And it feels a little less magical, and I started writing the wrong thing, and it was a nightmare of a process. And when I started writing this mystery, after having that realization, I'm not going to say it was easy. It's not like the words flowed out of me or anything, but it was much easier. It felt like, oh, this is what I should be doing. And I have to say, Iris, I have the exact same question for you, just because I have known you for so long as a writer, and not that you ever really wrote in one specific genre as a screenwriter. I mean, I think you actually had a lot of different kinds of material that you wrote, but I don't know if I had to predict, 15 years ago or 10 years ago, like, oh, well, Iris is going to write a couple of books one day. I don't know if I would have said that they would be thrillers necessarily. So I'm curious, how did you come to write these two books, and how does that also interact with your ongoing career as a screenwriter?
Well, I think I've always wanted to write a book, but I never could finish writing a book, but the screenwriting really helped me with tools like how to write a 3-act structure and having character arcs and everything, so that when I decided to go back to writing books, that it really helped me to actually finish a book. But as you know, in Hollywood you often get pegged as a certain kind of writer, and for me it was writing the Asian historicals, which is very hard to sell or to get produced all the way to production, because they're very expensive. Historicals in general are expensive. And then when you have a cast of Asian characters and they say, who's going to be your A-list star? And then it's sort of, the conversation just kind of ends there. So I was feeling kind of frustrated getting pegged into this hole and not being able to write other kinds of genre, which you know that I enjoy writing many different kinds of genre. And I enjoyed watching, I think, Jane Campion's Top of the Lake made me, just watching that made me want to write a mystery. I hadn't thought I was going to write a mystery either, but I think that show made me like, oh, this is so wonderful. I want to write something like this. And so I thought, oh, maybe I can try writing a mystery. And then that idea from over 20 years ago of that location just suddenly like came back to me, and thought, that would be a great place for a mystery.
Yeah.
So that's how that came about.
Oh, I love this Top of the Lake. That's like one of my top 5
Oh,
TV
really?
shows. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah, I absolutely.
great.
I love that show. Well, and I'm also curious, do you have any plans to write more in this world?
It's kind of weird. I'm not going to say I won't come back to the Kara Kennedy series, because a lot of people have asked me. But right now, I am working on an audio series for BBC, which is an Asian historical. But it's a very interesting story, and because it's already greenlit, I don't have to worry about, is it producible. But that is about the 442nd, which is an all Japanese American regiment that fought in Europe during World War II. But I do have an outline for my next book, and so when I'm done with this, I soon, hopefully, I'll be able to jump back into writing books. And that one is not in the Kara Kennedy series, but it has sort of the same sort of, a unique setting and a similar tone, I would say.
Okay. There are a lot of great characters in this world who are just, it's also, it reminded me in the best of ways a little bit of like a David Lynchian kind of Twin Peaks,
Yes, I love Twin Peaks, so that was
Yeah.
definitely an influence, I'm sure.
Yeah, I already told Iris, but there was one character, Aniko, who I really want to hear more from her. Maybe you can like take her essence and put her in another one of these stories or something.
I've actually had that suggestion from someone else as well, so
Yeah.
maybe.
She really pops in this story. The other thing I just wanted to ask you is this book, I think compared to the first book, it gets very actiony.
Yeah.
In like the last third. There's this big siege. I'm not really spoiling anything, but there's a big siege of where there's a lot of people involved on both sides. I won't get any more specific than that. And it's quite action packed, and there's guns and there's stakes, and it's really thrilling. But it's very different. I mean, I was surprised in a good way that it went there, and then I was like, that was the can't put it down point of the book, where I was just turning the pages until the end. But did you always know that it was going to take that super actiony turn like that, or was that
Yes,
just?
I always
Yeah?
thought like, it's gonna be big.
I mean, I guess you are a screenwriter, so it's it was a very big Hollywood
That
ending.
is my.
Yeah.
That's where I go. Yeah.
Should we take some audience questions? Or?
Sure.
Sure,
Yes.
that'd be great.
Does anyone
Cindy,
have
yeah.
questions? Anyone?
Well, I'll ask.
Oh, there's one.
How long is, for both of you guys, about how long is the writing process for something like this? Like the start to end, how long does it take?
The first book took me a long time because I was doing it on the side. I was still writing screenplays, and this was just sort of like a side, like whenever I had time. So that took me quite a while, at least 4 years. I had queried my current agent. I had queried her when I only had like 40 pages, and she she was really great in encouraging me to continue, because she said, well, where's the rest of the book? And I said, well, I'm still writing it. And she said, no, don't query until you have the book done. So I thought, okay, so I ruined my chance with her. But she kept asking me, so is it done yet? Is it done yet? Is it done yet? And I hadn't finished it when she said, you know what, this is during COVID, so these are strange times, let's just try and sell it. And so I somehow managed to get a deal from even not having finished the book. But the second book, there was a deal. So I was on, you have a time limit, and so I had to finish the book in a year. And I don't know how some writers do it, because some of them crank out 2 books a year, and I have a hard time even just doing one. And what about your book?
Yeah, no, similar. I mean, I feel like with each book it gets faster, which is what I wanted. I mean, my very first book, Decent Proposal, I probably took 6 years to write, because I didn't even know if I was going to finish it when I started it, and I was probably trying to represent you, Iris, while I was doing that
right.
on the side. And then this book was definitely a faster process, but I can't even say exactly how long that took. We're probably a year or 2, and then I've already written actually the second book in the series, because we're on, it's the whole publishing schedule of it's going to come out a year from now, so I needed to hand it in at the end of last year. And that was the other reason I wanted to do a series, because when you have an external deadline, it's much better motivator.
Right, yes.
And I feel the same way. I guess I started writing it actually. I started writing it a little too late, but I think I started it in June and I finished it at the end of November. So that's about 6 months. But it felt like a breakneck speed to me. I was very stressed out and didn't think that I would finish it in time. And I'm not going to do that again with the third one. I'm going to start earlier than June for sure.
Can you tell?
Sorry, go ahead.
Can you tell us what Agatha Christie book is the top ranked book?
Sure. So in the number 1 spot there's technically a tie for the top 2, but we did decide, that one would get in the case of a tie, we would just choose based on sort of our own subjective sense, since this is obviously very subjective. So it's 5 Little Pigs, actually, and then There Were None is number 2, and that's the one that I think most people would usually point to as probably the best Christie, but there are a lot of reasons why 5 Little Pigs is also really, really brilliant. And yeah, you can go to my website, KemperDonovan.com. I have the whole grid on there, and then of course there's 260 episodes of the podcast in which we go through every single novel and short story that Agatha Christie wrote, and I'm still doing a little bit of that because she wrote so many different things and so many outlier stories that there's still more material to cover. And then of course, as new adaptations come out, and there's always something to discuss about Agatha Christie.
Question for Kemper. Do you know if Hillary Clinton has read your book?
That's a good question.
I'm pretty sure she hasn't, because I'm very much trying to
Get it?
to her and figure out a way for her to read it. Yeah, which would, I do know that she's a big mystery fan, because she actually co-wrote a book with Louise Penny. And she did that because she's friends with Louise Penny, but she's a known hardcore mystery fan, so I think she would like it, but that's a long-term goal of mine.
Well, thank you both, Kemper Donovan, Iris Yamashita. Thank you for joining us at Chaucer's.
Oh, thank you. This
Thank
was really
for
fun.
having
Thank
us.
you.
Yeah.